now we have like really what I think are important developments taking place. Over the past several months, we've had Saudi Arabia talk about interest in BRICS. There are rumors that they're going to join BRICS sometime this summer. They've just joined, or they've just ratified, approved the decision to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And now you also have Brazil announcing Lula had to cancel his visit. He was going to visit this past week, but he had the flu. But they just announced a trade deal with China where they would trade specifically in RMB, or Chinese yuan, instead of the dollar. What is your reaction to these developments? First off, just what comes to mind for you?
Well, they go hand in hand with the fact that the global South countries, especially Brazil. By the way, Lula is going early next month to China. It was the pneumonia they had, I think, not the flu. They are in a squeeze today, especially now that the rise in the Federal Reserve's interest rate has increased the dollar's exchange rate. All these global South countries owe very heavy dollar debts. And they can't afford to pay these dollar debts and at the same time pay more money for their imports of oil and gas and food. So what are they going to do? Are they going to go without energy and turn off the lights and restrict their diets just so that they can pay foreign creditors, or they're not going to pay the foreign debts? Well, China has been playing a very active role in Africa and other countries, offering credit for Chinese exports on much softer terms than the United States, of not foreclosing or not calling countries in default, and indeed is backing a debt write down. Well, you can see where all this is heading at a certain point. We're not there yet, but China will say, well, you owe a lot of dollar debts that are pushing you into austerity and pushing you into reliance on the International Monetary Fund that is even more anti-labor than the Federal Reserve. You can deal with us, and we'll have our imports, and we will have a mutually beneficial trade with you on easier credit terms, and that you can afford. Just, but we realize that if you trade with us, you'll be sanctioned, just as countries that traded with Russia were sanctioned. So why don't you trade with us, 75% of the world's economy, instead of with the U.S. and Europe dollar euro block that's only 15 to 25% of the economy. We'll take care of you, and that really is where the global fracture between the dollar block and other blocks are going. The Western creditors and bondholders are saying, well, wait a minute, if we're going to wind down, have a debt write down, as occurred in the 1980s with the Brady bonds for Latin America debt write downs, then China has to write down its debts too. But China says, well, we've organized our credit as equity. Our credit is basically, again, for building ports, for building infrastructure that we've actually put in place that's going to be earning an income for the countries. We've made productive loans. The IMF loans, the World Bank loans, and similar bondholder loans are what's called odious debt. They're debt that does not help the client countries. The debtors earn the money to pay the debt with the interest, and it's debt that was negotiated by client oligarchies that were put in power and backed by the United States. This is the case especially in Brazil, because certainly at the time I was dealing on Wall Street with Brazilian foreign debt in 1990, over 30 years ago, almost just about all of Brazil's dollar debt was owed to the domestic Brazilian oligarchy. It was Brazilians who held the dollar-denominated Brazilian government bonds. I suspect that's still the case because American and European bondholders felt burned by Brazil, Argentina, and other Latin American countries. So apart from a few vulture funds buying these debts at low prices, you have the domestic oligarchy the domestic banking class, the financial class, the monopolist class, the old colonial class owning this debt. And since they're also the class that runs the central bank, and indeed for the government, they know they're going to pay the foreign debt because the foreign debt of Yankee dollars is paid to themselves. The Brazilian ruling class is the recipient of the Yankee dollars. So at some point, this debt crisis, certainly for countries like Brazil and I think Argentina also, are going to be involved, not necessarily a break simply with the US dollar, but with the domestic oligarchies that were client oligarchies of the United States. The oligarchies backed by the United States in overthrowing Lula years ago and replacing them with the dictator Bolsonaro, who's just returned to Brazil in the last couple of days. So you're going to have what is not only a global fracture, but it will finally be the domestic class war of socialism versus oligarchy. And that's the war that you had way back in Greece and Rome. That's why it's worthwhile seeing that all of these strains have occurred long before. They've occurred again and again. And you'd think that it would help to read a history of these strains and see what's worked out and what didn't work out. And in fact, the oligarchy almost always is won by violence. And that's been certainly the case in Brazil. I remember back in 1964, I met with Brazil's former president, I think Kubitschek, who'd just been overthrown, who told me and a few others who were with me the story and of what had happened, and just said, you have to live with it. This is America controls who's in control of Latin America. It's its backyard, and it only trusts dictators. It doesn't trust democratically elected leaders, because America is frightened that a democratically elected leader might represent the voters who elected him instead of the little U.S. embassy with envelopes stuck full of dollars and the army trained in the United States to overthrow democratic leaders. That's really the polarization dynamic that the whole world is facing today.
I want to actually bring up on that point a graph, an image that I think speaks to this phenomenon. And here, a lot of people are kind of surprised about Saudi Arabia's decision to diversify.
Is that the German flag?
No, this is the Saudi
Okay.
flag, I think. But it's the set. So this only goes to 2021. But here you just see, in terms of trade volume with China, China is Saudi Arabia's largest trading partner. And here you have the United States. Over the years, since 2001, you've seen, especially since over the last 5 to 8 years, a massive shrink in trade volume between the United States and Saudi Arabia, while China has really grown in terms of its influence in terms of trade. Can you talk about, back to your points on, the changing global economy and the what's happening with the dollar, but also what you spoke about earlier in the stream with regard to finance and how things have transpired? What exactly explains how you said, the United States, it supported all these oligarchies? Many people in the West would say, well, Saudi Arabia is one of those kind of client states, but Saudi Arabia is now moving much closer and closer to China. What explains this? Why is this happening, and why is it happening right now?
Well, in 1945, when the United States put the post-war economic order in place with the IMF, the World Bank, and other organizations, the United States was the leading industrial country, as well as financial country. And its control of the world gold, it actually increased its gold holdings by 1950 to 75% of the world's monetary gold. So other countries were convinced not to issue their own fiat currencies. England was committed by the United States as a debtor not to devalue sterling to make its exports competitive. Other countries pretty much in order to have access to money to recover, to fund their own economic recovery, and to buy industrial goods that they needed, had to rely on the United States. But since the epoch of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, the wealthy class in the United States, the 10%, found that it could make much more money by financial means than by industrial means. And in fact, corporate employers found they could increase profits not by lowering wages in the United States, but by simply moving their production facilities to China and other countries, Asia, and producing at lower wages. So the whole idea of free trade, especially under the Clintons after 1990, was an attempt to replace American industrial labor with Asian and other industrial labor, including the maquiladoras along the border with Mexico. Factories put just over the border to get low-priced, non-unionized labor, Mexican labor, as opposed to American labor. So you had a decision led by the Democratic Party to replace American labor with less expensive foreign labor, and under Clinton also to deregulate the financial sector and essentially turn what was a traditional commercial banking sector into a brokerage house sector, into financial gambling on derivatives, financial stock purchases, buying and selling companies. Money was made by over-industrial companies, not by expanding their profits and building more factories and machinery and hiring more labor to produce more. Money was made by going to Wall Street and buying money to take over companies, break them up, turn their real estate into gentrified housing instead of commercial use or industrial use, and essentially pushing the United States into what turned out, as if by a surprise, into dependency on other countries that are actually doing the production of the world. So now you have a critical mass of countries, 85% of the world's population, 75 to 85, saying, well, wait a minute, if we're producing all of the industrial products and raw materials that make industrial products, what do we need the dollar American and European rentiers for? What do we need American credit for if we can create our own credit, just the same way America does, electronically, just print it? That's modern monetary theory. What do we need foreign landlords and foreign owners of our raw materials from? The oil companies make big messes. They don't clean up the pollution they cause. We can just take them over and run mining and oil drilling in ways that are environmentally sound. What do we really need the United States and Europe for? What is its role? Well, the United States and Europe says, well, our role is to refrain from bombing you. Our role is not to treat you like we've treated Libya and Iraq and Syria. We can offer you not bombing you like we bombed these countries. That's all we can offer. And what do you think foreign countries think of that offer?
Yeah, it's a really bad one. I mean, it can get down to just that basic point there. It's really, you have the United States. That graph really kind of hits, I think, the nail on the head of that point of like, yeah, Saudi Arabia, despite how close it has been with the United States, it's not necessarily being offered more than what it's already received. And as China gains some more prominence, could you talk about actually, because China is really at the center of all of this. China is becoming the biggest trade partner for most countries in the world, Saudi Arabia included. Saudi Arabia is now making these decisions to diversify. So is Brazil, the BRICS countries, all these developments really have China at the center in a lot of ways, where the Chinese yuan is becoming increasingly important. How did this come to be? Because it wasn't too long ago where China was considered one of the poorest countries in the world. And now it's not only leading economically, but also A lot of these moves and developments have to do with diplomatic leadership and political leadership worldwide as well.
Well, two things. It's not only China, it's Russia. Saudi Arabia, for years, what it wanted more than anything else from the United States was arms, military arms, especially when its Sunni leadership was thinking of military war with Shiite Iran. So the one thing that Saudi Arabia did depend on United States industry for was armaments. Airplanes, especially. And in the last few months, Saudi Arabia has begun to buy arms from Russia. And you can imagine what this does to how this has upset the American military industrial complex, because this was where America basically was making enormous monopoly rents off its high priced armaments. And other countries do not have such high costs as Pentagon capitalism does. Well, you can see what was happening with Saudi Arabia. It thought, well, America's always really wanted to control our oil industry, and it's always been threatening that it'll become our enemy if we make peace with Iran. Well, we want to make peace with Iran because otherwise Iran may blow up our oil fields, and they may sink a ship in the Gulf of Hormuz and prevent our exports from occurring. So the Saudi Arabians are deciding you never want to put all your eggs in one basket. They're diversifying, and that includes Russia. But also regarding China, America realizes, or Saudi Arabia realizes, that if for any reason Iran is pushed into sinking a ship in Hormuz to stop the oil trade, that there's another route to Europe. And the Chinese, in the last few weeks, have been talking to Saudi Arabia about a long, roundabout sea trade route up through the Pacific, up to the Arctic Ocean, and then down through Europe from the north, not from the south in the Mediterranean. So that's one thing. But your real question, I think, was about why has China pulled ahead and not the United States? China is pulling ahead by doing exactly what the United States is doing in the late 19th century. It's pulled ahead by using an active government sector to subsidize basic needs. The United States in the 19th century, and this was all spilled out by the first professor of economics at the first business school in the United States, Simon Patton, who taught at the University of Pennsylvania. He said the United States emphasizes a fourth factor of production besides labor, land, and capital, and that's public infrastructure spending, like the Erie Canal has made possible the grain exports, the Midwestern grain coming in to upstate New York and to the East Coast. He said that public railroads, public education, public health, all of this is the role of the government infrastructure is to lower the cost of living by providing basic needs like education, healthcare, a job freely, freely or at least at a subsidized cost. Well, this is what made American industry able to undersell industries that did not have as rapid as well-developed a public sector in Europe. Well, since Reagan and Thatcher privatized the public sector, now you have the public sector trying to make profits. The railroad system was privatized when the Butcher brothers of Philadelphia broke up Penn Central and separated all of the real estate from the railroad, and then sold off the real estate, leaving the railroads without real estate financing, and obviously the costs went way up. You had the privatization and carve up and breakup of the public sector in the United States. The costs went way up. That's why privatized healthcare in the United States absorbs 18% of GDP. Whereas even in conservative England in the 19th century, Benjamin Disraeli, the conservative prime minister, said, health, all is health, and wanted to provide health care. And after World War II, Britain's National Health Service was a model for the whole rest of the world. Now it's been Thatcherized, and especially under Tony Blair and the Labour Party, as usual, which has moved to the right of the conservatives, just as the Democrats are now to the right of the Republicans in the United States. Now it's all different. Well, China has kept not only kept basic infrastructure in the public domain, but it's kept the most important public utility in the public domain, banking. You have the Bank of China creating the credit. And the function of the Bank of China is not to create public credit for takeover loans, to take over companies, break them up, and reduce employment. It's to help the economy grow. It's the function of a government-controlled bank is to increase capital investment and employment and construction for housing to provide for the economy's basic needs. Well, that is what has enabled China and other countries that are following the mixed economy plan to outperform the United States. And that's what the United States says autocracy. The United States says China is an autocracy because it has public banking instead of leaving it in private hands to do to China what our banks have done to the American economy. So you can imagine how humorous, in a way, this seems. It's obviously, the autocracies are socialist countries with a mixed economy where the government provides public basic needs. Democracies don't. Democracies abolish the infrastructure, privatize it, usually selling it off to American or European buyers, and say that there's no such thing as a basic human need. Land can be a commodity to make financial gains from by charging rent that people have to borrow money to buy. There's no such thing as a public need for health. Health is not a basic right. It's a monopoly opportunity for pharmaceutical companies and health insurance companies to make enormous gains. Having a job is not a public right. And losing a job is a right of the financial and corporate class to create enough unemployment to keep wages down so that profits ostensibly can go up. So basically, a democracy is a country that lives in the short run for privatized financial gains, and an autocracy takes long-run planning into account and keeps planning in the democratically elected sector, not in the hands of the financial centers such as Wall Street, Paris, the City of London, or other banking centers. That's the real split of the world, and it's not democracy versus autocracy. It's financialization versus socialized mixed economies.